Lutherans and the 1848 cholera epidemic. Cholera is a bacterial disease usually spread by water. It is fatal if not treated right away. Key symptoms are diarrhea and dehydration, while shock and seizures may occur in severe cases. Modern treatment includes rehydration, IV fluids, and antibiotics. However, in the first half of the 19th century, doctors and academics applied the miasma theory to cholera. This theory stated that diseases like cholera and the bubonic plague were caused by pollution or bad air. The germ theory of disease had not yet been developed. Therefore, most preventative measures were not very effective. The third cholera epidemic, from 1846 to 1860, was the third major outbreak of cholera. It originated in India in the 19th century, and it reached far beyond its borders, killing over 1 million in Russia. This pandemic was considered to have the highest fatalities of all the 19th century epidemics. It had high fatalities among populations in Asia, Europe, Africa, and North America. Cholera was believed to have spread from Irish immigrant ships from England to the United States. Thousands died in New York, a major destination for Irish immigrants. During the California Gold Rush, cholera was transmitted along the California, Mormon, and Oregon trails, as about 12,000 are believed to have died on their way to Utah and Oregon in the cholera years of 1849 to 1855. Cholera also easily spread throughout the Mississippi River system. The outbreak that struck Nashville in 1849 through 1850 took the life of former President James K. Polk. Cholera took the lives of over 3,000 in New Orleans and killed over 4,500 in St. Louis, a center of German immigration and the location of Concordia Seminary, the publishing house of Der Lutheraner, and the home of pastors C.F.W. Walther, F.C.D. Winnikin, and other major figures in the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Walther's bi-monthly publication, Der Lutheraner, was mostly focused on doctrinal discussions, church news, and church history. Walther and others rarely commented on current events outside the spiritual sphere. Even when the cholera epidemic was raging through the nation, the pattern continued. Perhaps part of the reason for this was that this was the third cholera pandemic that most adults in 1849 experienced. It wasn't a novelty. This doesn't mean that Walther avoided the topic altogether. Walther had a strong ability to put things into context. He was an avid researcher who would find what reliable Lutheran authorities did in previous pandemics in history. The first thing he did was to reference Martin Luther himself. Privately, Walther was deeply affected by the cholera pandemic and was well aware of its danger and the need for proper pastoral practice. In a letter dated May 10, 1849, Walther wrote to Wilhelm Seeler in Fort Wayne, "Now I come to a matter which I write last, because it is very painful for me. It will most likely be completely impossible for me to take part in the forthcoming convention of our synod. For more than a month we have had a cholera epidemic here, and every week it is more destructive. It was not until yesterday, however, that I had the first case of death in my congregation on account of this plague. A healthy, lively girl of 16 died after 14 hours of illness. But in the city in general, the plague is raging to such an extent that, wherever one is, one constantly sees the hearse coming and going. Whole families have died, and especially some parts of the city, where the Germans and the Irish live, are so hard hit that the residents live in constant fear and dread. Some die after 2 or 4 hours of the disease, right after they had felt it, even though they were at their healthiest and strongest. The sick usually retain consciousness to the last moment, and thus there's always a little hour of grace to hear God's word and to be fortified with the Holy Sacrament. Now, St. Louis today is so spread out that if the plague once gets the upper hand in the congregation, one pastor could not possibly meet every need. To this is the added danger, that one of the pastors will also be swept away by the pestilence, for it does not seem that it is catching even if it is not so in the past. Luther impresses it emphatically on pastors in his little work, Whether a Pastor May Flee from Dying, which I am thinking of republishing, that they, above all, dare not abandon the lambs in such need. So as much as I will lose thereby, and as much as I thereby place a burden on you, you will see yourself that I cannot with good conscience sacrifice my immediate duties toward the congregation entrusted to me in favor of my love for our synod. The members of my congregation, some of whom live in considerable terror of this frightful judgment of God, and who right well know the duties of a Lutheran pastor, would take it very poorly if I would leave them in such a need. And still more would I be blamed by those who might have to die without spiritual comfort during my absence. And some might even, with the world, think that I was with joy taking advantage of the synodical convention as a good opportunity to get out of the dangerous situation, and that in the most difficult time, for with the increasingly hot weather the raging of the plague has been noticeably increasing. It is expected that in June and July it will reach its highest level. On May 15th, Walther published an article entitled Description of a Plague. Filling several columns, Walther inserted a lengthy quote from a 1633 pamphlet by Friedrich Schatz, a dean who had lived in Schwiednitz, Germany, during a time of widespread disease and warfare. On May 29th, Walther published an anecdote titled Godly Protection During Plague to illustrate God's protection for his people in time of pandemic. This time, Walther referenced Justus Jonas, a personal friend of Martin Luther. According to the story, when Jonas was a young boy, his father was deadly ill with the plague. He sat himself down at a bench, and the father set a fried onion on one of his boils, apparently as some kind of poultice. But 1 moment later, the young son, Justus, entered the room and swallowed the onion whole. The father was sure that his son would perish, but contrary to that expectation, he grew up to be, quote, an important tool for the spread of pure doctrine, unquote. On June 12th, Walther used 6 columns to publish a letter from 1564 called A Letter of Comfort from Dr. Nicholas Selniker during a time of plague, written to a good friend. But in July, there was a sharp shift from historical references. Pastor Sigmund Butterman of Chester, Illinois, had died within 7 hours of his first symptoms of cholera. So sudden was his death that his obituary in Der Lutheraner was published 1 page after his own editorial that he had sent in to Walther. Butterman had been previously educated for the ministry in Germany and had come to America, where he continued his studies under Dr. Walther, who had learned to love and respect Butterman as a student. With the spring of the year 1849, Walther was happy to send the candidate, aged 29, to St. John Lutheran Church in Chester, Illinois. There he guided the organization of the congregation and began regular teaching and preaching. Yet, after 2 months, he was dead. His tombstone reads, Here rests in Jesus Sigmund Butterman, first evangelical Lutheran pastor in Chester, born September 13, 1819, in Werferlinger, Prussia, died July 12, 1848. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations. Psalm 90, verse 1. We hoped you liked this video. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. God's Word and Luther's doctrine pure shall to eternity endure.